Hey students, so for your next round of editing, you'll now be editing for literary and rhetorical devices. So similarly to our previous round, just as authors use syntax and diction, they also use literary and rhetorical devices. And guys, you're an author too. So you're just not going to analyze how other authors do it. You got to do it yourself as well. And so we're going to go through a series of literary devices and rhetorical devices that would be particularly useful in a narrative essay, and you will determine where in your essay you want to use these. I do think these directions are worth reading directly to you, so I'm going to go over it really quickly. So I kind of just said that. Let's start here. So remember that devices help build modes. For example, diction creates tone, and tone creates pathos. Similarly, allusions create authority, and authority creates ethos. One more time, rhetorical questions control your reader's thought process, and that is key for building logos. So when you guys are using your literary and rhetorical devices, you need to use them purposefully. If you want to create pathos in this part of your narrative, think about which tools would specifically help develop that pathos. And the same goes with ethos. If you're like, I need to establish my authority here, what can you use to help do that? If you're like, here's where my argumentation needs to be really strong, I need to utilize logos. How do you create logos? And keep that in mind when you're choosing your devices, because they have purposes, not porpoises, but purposes. All right, let me go to my presentation and let's start looking at the different devices that you might use in your essay. All right, so the first one is rhetorical questions. So a rhetorical question is a question not intending to be answered, but instead intending to persuade or evoke an emotion. Furthermore, the purpose is to provoke thought in an audience so that they will consider information crucial to the argument more deeply. And so it's the idea, I'm not going to go over all of these examples. They're there for you to look at. More so I'm just going to talk about kind of what these devices emphasize. That way you can understand like why you would use them. So for rhetorical questions, they go really well in logical arguments in which you want to help your readers think about certain questions that will get them on the same path of your logical reasoning. And so it's really engaging for an audience because they become part of the logical reasoning as you ask them questions. However, for instance, here, if you do read this example, a lot of times rhetorical questions have an implied answer. So you're not actually leaving it totally open to your audience. It's actually a bit of a guide. So for instance, in this example, Kennedy's rhetorical questions are addressed directly to the audience. The implied yes answer to each question prompts listeners to accept the challenges named in the speech. And so when a rhetorical question is used completely genuinely, you might just be like, yeah, think about this, audience. But that's often not how it's used. It's used with the idea that the way the question is phrased kind of already suggests what the answer might be. And so you're guiding your audience on an actual thought path. There's another device that we'll learn later called hypophora, in which you actually answer the question and you're very controlling over the thought path that your audience takes. All right, let's look at parenthesis. So in our previous videos, we learned about syntax, and parentheses were used in there. So this goes hand in hand with some of those syntactic lessons. So a parenthesis occurs when you have an interrupting phrase or list that provides more information. The phrase or list is marked by commas, dashes, or parentheses on both sides. So this might remind you of patterns, I believe 7 and 7, the 7 patterns, they utilize parenthesis. And so remember that when you use a dash, that's because you want to indicate emphasis and like something loud and important. When you use parentheses, it's kind of like an aside, it's more of a whisper. And when you use commas, it is a consistent tone. So when I first read the novel Frankenstein, I was about 14 at the time, it terrified me. So think about the tone you want to create when you're using parenthesis, but parenthesis allows for you to put an interrupting phrase right in the middle of your sentence, and it adds a lot of personality to writing. So we talked about how in your narrative essay, because it's a more informal essay, to kind of infuse it with your personality, this is a really great tool to do so. All right, understatement. So an understatement is making something seem lesser, smaller, or more insignificant than it really is. And there's kind of two primary reasons why you would use understatement. The first is because it's often used for the purpose of humor and ridicule. It's used satirically. So for instance here, this isn't exactly how it goes down in Monty Python, but it's definitely a reference to it, where this guy's arm's been cut off and he says, "I've had worse, 'tis but a scratch." So it's the idea that creates humor, because that's more than a scratch. He's lost his arm. And so the understatement creates humor. And we see that here. It looks like it rained a bit last night. It's a flood. So that's how understatement's sometimes used. Another way you can use it is not satirically. Sometimes it's used to comfort an audience by making a situation seem less dire. So for instance, here we have cannibalism is frowned upon in most societies. Actually, I don't think this is really used to comfort an audience. I think this is actually used for a different reason, and it's to maintain an objective tone. So I'm pretty sure this is taken from a journal article about cannibalism, and it's not very kind of scientifically professional to be like, man, cannibals are freaky. That's sociologists should just not be putting that in their journals. And so it's the idea that they kind of understate it in order to sound more objective. And so there's a lot of reasons you can use understatement. Those are three of them. Litote. So litotes are fun. It's when the phrasing using the word not that either creates an ironic statement, understatement, an active emphasis, or veils a criticism. So litote kind of is like a sister to understatement. And let's look at an example, because it's a little hard to understand it just from the definition. So here it says, it was no small accomplishment. So we're using no or not. And the problem here is why don't you just say that was a big accomplishment? Like, good job, you did a great job. Instead, they say it was no small accomplishment. And so it's the idea that it's like, why phrase it with this extra wordage? And so the reason why people use this extra wordage is to be ironic, to emphasize, or to veil a criticism. So for this first one, I think the purpose is an active emphasis, where they're emphasizing that the accomplishment was a big one, where you say that was no small accomplishment. It emphasizes the fact that the accomplishment was big. So here we have, it wasn't a big deal. So here I don't like that one. Let's go to a different one. This one's better. So a cup of coffee would not be unwelcomed. So it's the idea that why not just say, I would like a cup of coffee, but instead they say would not be unwelcomed. And I think that this again goes to the idea of emphasis, of the idea they would really like a cup of coffee. So this one is used differently. So it's not the smartest idea I've ever heard. So this goes under kind of the veiled criticism, the idea where instead of saying that was a stupid idea, they say it's not the smartest idea. And so while they're not calling the person stupid, they ultimately are. It's just hidden by the use of not the smartest idea. So by making it more wordy, by using the litote, it veils the criticism. And so that is an example of how to use a litote in that way. Here we have the former CEO's lifestyle was not shabby, which may explain why the company went bankrupt. Here, this might kind of fall under the ironic statement, where it's emphasizing the fact that the CEO had a very lavish lifestyle, and so it's kind of pointing out the cynical humor of the situation. And so that's how you use litotes. All right, allusions, you should be familiar with this one. It's a reference to a famous person, place, or thing. And when you do that, when you reference something, you take all of the knowledge that is within that story or event or person or place, and you use it in your sentence. So it's a very efficient tool. The thing about allusions is if your reader or your audience doesn't understand what you're alluding to, the sentence will be meaningless to them. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, eponym. An eponym is very similar to an allusion, but the way it's used is quite different. So an eponym occurs when a person after whom a discovery, invention, place, or action is named are thought to have been named. So for instance, if you watch How I Met Your Mother, this is an example from it. Just play cool. Don't Ted out about it. So here what Lily's doing is, instead of saying don't freak out about it, she's using Ted's name in the place of the word freak. And so essentially what the eponym is doing is it's using someone's name to replace a concept that they are super closely linked to. And so we see that with Achilles' heel, a Freudian slip, chauvinism, Caesar salad, Megan's law. These are people's names, and their names have been used to represent something that they're closely linked to. Eponyms are very relevant in law. So for instance, if you've ever said, hey, can I have a Kleenex, or do you have any chapstick? Those are actually eponyms, because Kleenex, chapstick, Coke, all of those things are actual brand names that we're using to refer to a general product. Kleenex, you actually mean like a facial tissue. Chapstick, you mean lip balm. And Coke, you mean soda. And so you're using the specific name because it's so closely tied to the product to represent all of the product. And that's an eponym. And interestingly, with eponyms, if you can prove that a company like name has turned into an eponym, that messes up kind of their ability to file for copyright infringements. And so that's why it's really important in law. All right, Sententia. So Sententia sounds tough, but it's actually a really straightforward tool. So it's a moral saying taken from an ancient or popular source that applies a general truth to something. It often occurs at the beginning of a writing or speech. So Sententia, you have probably already used. So in your essays, if you've opened up an essay or used somewhere in your introduction a quote that comes from an ancient source or a very popular source, a very well-known quote, and you use it kind of as a central focus for the opening of your writing, you've used Sententia. Now you can't just like have the quote and move on. You actually have to utilize it in the start purposefully, but that's how Sententia works. So again, Sententia, eponym, allusions, they're all within the same family. They're referencing famous things and utilizing all the information that's stored within that famous thing to create more meaning in their own writing. Zeugma sounds like a type of dance. Zeugma. What is a Zeugma? So Zeugmas are very clever. They're kind of hard to create. So if you're able to successfully use a Zeugma, good for you. But a Zeugma is using a word, often a verb, to act with two or more parts of a sentence. It is often considered wordplay that is intended to cleverly point out complexity or irony in a situation. So let's look at an example. I just blew my nose, a fuse, and 3 circuit breakers. So here we have this verb blew, and then it applies to 3 different events. I blew my nose, I blew a fuse, which I think is supposed to be kind of like an emotional fuse, and 3 circuit breakers, which is an actual real fuse. And so it's the idea that this verb actually means 3 different things depending on which it's applying to. And the kind of clever aspect of it, the irony of it, is what they're essentially showing here is how frustrated they are. They're sick, they're losing their patience, and now their power's out. And so it's very clever. Here we have another example. This is one from Star Trek. Yeah, and I remember the episode this one came from. So you are free to execute your laws and your citizens as you see fit. So here we have the verb execute, and it applies to your laws and your citizens. And so the idea when you execute a law, that means you essentially are enacting a law or using a law. When you execute your citizens, you're killing them. And so the word execute has two different meanings here, and it's being applied within the same sentence. And essentially, the complexity it's pointing out is the fact that the unfairness of the laws is what's leading to the unfair execution of the citizens. And so it shows the complexity of injustice within a legal system. All right, we're going to pause here, and I'll see you in video 2 for the rest of our terms. Bye.